And I remember my dad saying something really interesting. He said, well, imagine like it's going from New York to Pennsylvania. And I thought that was such a great metaphor that this is a true story. Literally, a week later, I booked a low budget trip to Egypt because I had a lot of time on my hands in this semester abroad. And I thought it's just like going from New York to California from when I told my dad. He wasn't really particularly amused, but it was there when I was in Egypt and traveling around the Middle East and all over the world that I realized that there's this profound influence on my behavior and across all different levels, politics, organizations, and it was culture. And I really wanted to learn more about it. And so I packed my bags after graduating from Colgate, and I went to work with Harry Triandis to really use the best of scientific tools to understand culture. And I want to say that Harry was just a remarkable person. He passed away last year. He taught me the history of the field of cultural psychology, the methods and methodological challenges that we have when we're doing cross-cultural research. But he also taught me a lot about life. And some of his advice, his famous advice to his students that I try to really practice and pass on to my students is, first of all, he said, be passionate about what you do. For many of us, that's not so difficult. He also said, don't be afraid to be controversial. And the most important thing probably he said was, don't take yourself too seriously. And I think he was a Buddhist by nature. But anyway, I just want to have a shout out and tribute to Harry because he was a phenomenal mentor and person. And we all in cross-cultural psychology stand on his shoulders. So when I left Champaign-Urbana after getting my PhD, I traveled the world and was noticing a lot of different contrasts. And for example, in Singapore, which is called the fine country, you can get punished for various different things like chewing gum or littering or not flushing the toilet in public. Even walking in front of your curtains naked at night could cause you to get slammed with a fine. If you take a short plane ride over to New Zealand, you'll see very different types of behaviors. People, for example, walking barefoot in banks. You might see large quantities of bras hung on fences. You might see college students breaking out some fires on campus to celebrate. If you take another plane ride over to, let's say, to Germany, you'll see other contrasts with other nations. For example, you might find people waiting very patiently on street corners, even if there's no cars around. Whereas my own beloved New York, people jaywalk with great frequency, including with children in tow, as you can see. What's interesting about this picture on the left, this is being tested in various German cities, and it's called street pong, and it's a great device to help incentivize people staying put. So this person here is playing ping pong electronically with the person across the street. And I've seen this technology that actually tells you when you're about to be able to cross the street. And so it keeps you entertained while you're staying put. But on a more serious note, we also see other contrasts around the world. Why is it that you can openly smoke weed in some areas in Amsterdam and even in the United States now, and you can get the death penalty for this same behavior in other countries? So I was interested in understanding what ties these examples together. And really what it boils down to, what I'm going to talk about today, is they all reflect differences in social norms or unwritten rules of behavior that sometimes get more formalized in terms of laws and codes. And social norms are really one of humans' most important inventions. They help us to coordinate and to predict each other's behavior at an unprecedented level. I mean, you can try to do a thought experiment and think about a world without social norms. Imagine going outside of your house and driving and people are on either side of the street and not obeying stop signs. Or imagine you go into your favorite restaurant and people are chewing with their mouths wide open, they're stealing food off each other's plates, and they're belching loudly. This might sound like my New York family dinner, actually. Or imagine people are having sex everywhere, in movie theaters, on buses, and it's not reserved for private settings. There's a reason why humans develop social norms, is to avoid these kinds of scenarios. In many ways, social norms are the glue that keep us together. But what I've been studying over the last decade is that this glue is stronger in certain contexts than others. And this is what I refer to as the difference between tight and loose cultures. Tight cultures have strong norms and punishments that restrict the range of behavior that's seen as permissible. Loose cultures are much more permissive and they have weaker norms and they afford a much wider range of behavior. And I'm going to talk about these constructs today, how we can look at very macro differences in tight loose and even down to the individual level, and whether or not there's some kind of homology across different levels of analysis in terms of what causes the evolution of tightness and looseness and what its consequences are for human groups. I want to mention that one of the first people that started to talk about tight loose, perhaps not with this language, was Herodotus. His Histories book, which is arguably the first cross-cultural psychology textbook, talks about countries that he's visited that had a lot of permissiveness versus strictness, like Egypt, where there were a lot of rules for authority and gender and sexuality, as compared to the Persians that he described as quite loose. What I wanted to look at was how we can start thinking about measuring tightness looseness in modern nations. And so today, what I'm going to talk about are whether or not modern nations differ on the strength of norms. All cultures have tight and loose elements, but it might be the case that some cultures veer tighter or looser. And the question is, what predicts that variation? And again, what are the consequences of the variation? I want to share with you also how we can use the constructs to understand variation into deeper history, let's say pre-industrial patterns, so that we can see this is perhaps not a modern invention. I want to then talk about how we can use tight-loose theory to understand differences across different levels of analysis, from nations to states, and to even how we process information in the brain. Then I'm going to talk about an age-old question, which is better, tight or loose? And I'll have you kind of vote, and then later on tell me what you said. And then I'm going to talk about tight, loose, and corona and some of the data that we have on evolutionary dynamics and potential mismatches in trying to deal with collective threat. There's been no other time in history, of course, where we've had this experiment where we can see how countries around the world are adapting to COVID. And I want to share some of the data and modeling that we've been doing on that. So that's the agenda. So let me just start by talking about the first study that we did on this, the most macro level of analysis, which was cultural variation in tight loose across nations. This study was done across different continents and nations with adults and students. And really the goal of the study was to try to see if we can measure tightness looseness and show that it has convergent and divergent validity. And then to start thinking about what are the ecological and historical correlates of tight loose. We used surveys, we used a lot of archival data dating back to 1500. And we also started to do unobtrusive observations. And I'll describe a lot of the work that we did on this that was published in the journal Science. And so what we did first in this study was try to see if we can map the world in terms of the strength of norms. We asked people in various different countries to respond to a reference shift question about social norms defined as unwritten rules for behavior in their nations. So this is a reference shift model. So people were asked, are there many social norms that people are supposed to abide by in this country? How do people react if people don't abide by norms? Is there a lot of freedom, latitude in terms of how people are allowed to behave? And do people comply with norms? These are some of the questions that we asked, among others. We also asked people to tell us how appropriate 15 behaviors were across 15 situations, something that Price and Buffard used as a measure of situational strength. Libraries, for example, tend to be much more stronger in terms of the situational strength, where there's less variability in what's seen as permissible as compared to, let's say, a public park. And we could see that these measures of the strength of situations and these more global measures of tight loose were highly correlated. And also, much more importantly, we could see that it was a shared construct. There were high RWGs, countries that tended to be loose tended to agree that they're loose, likewise with tight cultures. And also there was wide variation around the world in responses to these items. Countries like Japan and Singapore, Germany, Austria tended to veer tended to veer tight. Cultures like New Zealand and Brazil, Italy, Netherlands, the US tended to veer loose. Tight loose is a continuum, and we can see that although there are loose and tight domains in all cultures, that we can still see that they vary generally on the construct. I want to mention that we also see a lot of divergent validity with the constructs and others. For example, tight loose is related to but distinct from individual and collectivism, something I worked on quite a bit with Harry. Often it's the case in previous research that we were confounding the concepts. For example, East Asian cultures tend to be tight and collectivistic. The US and Australia and New Zealand tend to be loose and individualistic. But there are off diagonals countries that are also tight and individualistic. Countries like Germany and Austria and Switzerland tend to be individualistic, but veer tighter. And also there were collectivist cultures in our data that are very family oriented, but also tended to be looser, including places like Brazil and Spain and Italy. We also see that tight loose was unrelated at the national level to GDP. So there are tight countries that are rich and tight cultures that are poor, and vice versa with looseness. And also we talk a lot about how tight loose relates to other constructs and is distinct from things like power distance and so forth. So what we want to see in this study is what are the kind of correlates of tightness and looseness? What kinds of benefits and detriments do they provide for human groups depending on your vantage point? So what we can see across the data, and I'm summarizing now, you can go to my website to see more information, but tight cultures in the data had a lot of order. They had much less crime and they had much more monitoring. There's a great story on NPR's Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me show that many of you probably listened to, where Peter Sagal was asking, what do Japanese police officers need more of? And we were all guessing they need more vacation time, they need higher pay. And it turns out the answer is they need more crime, because crime is so low in Japan that apparently some years ago, some police officers were egging people on to try to commit minor crimes because they were so bored. Tight cultures tend to also have more uniformity. In our data, they tend to have people wearing more similar clothes, driving more similar cars. Even the city clocks tend to actually have more uniformity, more synchrony in tight cultures. We could see that in countries that have strict norms, that the clocks are much more likely to be in sync. In looser cultures, the times on city streets tend to be kind of all over the place. You're not totally sure what time it is. And also what we found is that tight cultures have more synchrony in other areas of life. For example, in stock markets, in R squared, what financial economists talk about, tight cultures have much more tightly coupling buying and selling behavior. So synchrony is really a core attribute of tight cultures. Also, we know that tight cultures tend to have more self-control. When you live in an environment where there's a lot of social control, you learn from a young age to manage your impulses. And that has a host of other consequences. There tends to be, at the national level, controlling for various factors, more debt in loose cultures, less debt in tight cultures. Tight cultures have less obesity, they have less alcoholism, and they have less drug abuse. In some of the research for my book, Rule Makers, Rule Breakers, I also found that there's some evidence that points to the fact that pets in tight cultures tend to be skinnier than pets in loose cultures. And I, N of one experience with my own Portuguese water dog, attests to that. This just suggests that tight cultures corner the market on order, and loose cultures struggle with order. They have higher crime, less synchrony, and they have a host of self-regulation failures. But loose cultures tend to corner the market on openness. In our data, they have much more tolerance for different types of people on world value surveys, on subliminal types of measures using the IIT. We see that there's much more acceptance of people of different races, religions, creeds, the stigmatized. Of course, there's always problems in terms of tolerance. So we're talking about relative differences. And in one example that I published recently in PLOS ONE, we had people, RAs of mine, going around different countries wearing different types of stigmas. So for example, in one condition, they were wearing tattoos and nose rings. In another condition, they were wearing fake facial warts that I had bought from them on the internet. And in a third condition, they were just wearing their normal face. And we asked them to go and ask for help in city streets and for help in stores. We standardized this protocol in Bremen, Germany, and we sent these RAs back to their home countries. And what we found was really interesting. When people were just wearing their normal face, there was no difference in helping behavior across these 20 plus nations. But when people were wearing these strange nose rings and tattoos, or they were wearing these facial warts, they got much less help in tight cultures as compared to loose cultures. So we know that tolerance is something that loose cultures corner the market on. Loose cultures also have much more creativity, much more idea generation. In crowdsourcing studies, we can see that people from loose cultures are much more likely to enter those contests, and they're more likely to win. And finally, loose cultures also tend to be more open to change. in computational models, when we have a cultural shock and we see that loose cultures have a new norm that is more beneficial for the population, they're more likely to actually change earlier than tight cultures. So these are just some of the attributes of tight and loose cultures. And we'll see that these actually apply across different levels of analysis to states and even at the neurobiological level that I'll get to shortly. But the question is, what predicts tight loose? Why might it evolve in the first place? There's no effective GDP, as I mentioned. There's no common language or religion. There's no common geographical location that unites loose cultures on the one hand and tight cultures on the other. So I'll ask you to just think about this in your own mind right now. What would you nominate as potential predictors of tight loose? And I'm going to go ahead and just show you the data, but I'm glad to later talk about what came up in your mind in terms of what might predict this. But basically, the gist is that we went into this study thinking that tight cultures and loose cultures might be differentiated on the degree to which they experience collective threat. Collective threat here could be from Mother Nature, think chronic natural disasters or famine, but it could also be collective threat coming from human nature. Think about the number of times your nation has been potentially invaded by its neighbors, or it could be pathogen types of threats, or even things like population density, where there's a lot of people per square mile. Take Singapore, for example, that has 20,000 people per square mile, compared to New Zealand that has about 50 people per square mile and more sheep per capita, I'm told, than people. The idea is actually pretty simple. When countries have a lot of collective threat, they need more coordination. And strict rules help to produce that kind of coordination that's necessary for survival. And you can see some proof of concept with some data here that we published. We gathered data as we were collecting the surveys on population density as far back as 1500, food deprivation, amount of arable land, disasters, chronic natural disasters, territorial threat, how many times has your nation been potentially invaded in the last 100 years, and pathogen prevalence for both historically and modern day. And in all of these cases, you can see that as these collective threats are increasing, so is tightness. I'll talk later about some evolutionary game theoretic models that we can try seeing some of the causality at the population level, because this is all correlational data, but it does give some proof of concept that there might be a connection between collective threat and tightness. There's also, of course, other predictors as well, and some of them, again, have to do with coordination. In a recent study that was published in PNAS, Thomas Talham and his colleagues showed that the percent of production in a country that was related to rice as compared to wheat was actually correlated with tightness. And this makes a lot of sense because cultivating rice is a serious coordination problem that human groups need stricter rules and punishments in order to solve that coordination problem. There's other predictors as well in our data. For example, relational mobility tends to go along with looseness because in these contexts, it's harder to agree upon norms for behavior. Diversity also pushes groups towards looseness. And of course, there's not always a strong connection of any of these predictors and tightness. These are only correlations and predictors. There are some tight cultures that have very little threat and vice versa with loose cultures. So this is a general predictor. But I think it does help us to try to understand human behavior with a little less ethnocentrism. Let's take that ban on gum in Singapore, which from an American point of view seems absolutely ridiculous. But when you think about how many people are there per square mile, so many mouths per capita was causing a lot of problems in the 80s, late 80s. People were chewing their gum and putting it on the floor, like many of us like to do, and it was causing a national problem. It was blocking sensors for elevators and trains. And Lee Kuan Yew said to people, hey guys, we're gonna have to ban this tasty treat because it's causing so many problems. Now, not all cultural differences can be boiled down to tight loose for sure, but it just suggests that once we understand why we might vary across cultures, why some things might be adaptive to the ecological context and historical context of nations, we might have a little less ethnocentrism. So I want to just mention that this is not just a modern day phenomenon. We can also look at differences in tightness looseness in pre-industrial eras. Of course, we can't survey people in these contexts. So here we turn to a different method, which is ethnography. And I partnered with Carol Ember, Josh Jackson, where for the last several years, we were coding very rich samples of ethnographies in terms of the degree to which norms constrain behavior and whether there was strict punishments for deviance. This builds on an earlier study by Pietro Pelto, who started looking at tight loose in the late 80s using more structural measures. And we wanted to actually use similar measures as in the science paper. So we coded, in this case, various different domains of life that many ethnographers tend to talk about. For example, law and ethics and socialization, from both when you're first born to as you're going through early childhood to adulthood. We coded the domain of gender in terms of how strict the regulations were around gender roles, and marriage, how loose or tight was the context of marriage, sexuality, and also funeral and mourning. Again, all these contexts are discussed by ethnographers, so we can go in and zoom in and code them. And we had a lot of RAs on this project, and we wanted to show that we can reliably code them. You see here on the left that funerals were the tightest domain across all pre-industrial groups. But what we see here on the right is when we factor analyze these domains, that there is an underlying latent factor such that there tends to be basically covariation across domains. Societies that had high tightness in law and ethics tended to also have tightness across other domains, and vice versa for loose groups. So I want to show you that in this paper, it just came out recently in the Proceedings of Royal Society B, we can see across the world variation in tight, loose, and pre-industrial societies. And what we can see also using other data on these groups, that there also is a sense of similarity in terms of predictors of collective threat with these groups. For example, higher population density, warfare, pathogens, and scarcity tended to be correlated with tightness. Other correlates were also interesting. For example, high complexity tended to be correlated with tightness, which makes sense because as societies become more complex, they need more coordination. There were other interesting findings also. We found, for example, that there were more moralistic gods in tighter cultures that were seen as watching over human groups. And in a psych science paper recently, we find something quite similar, that actually when groups have a lot of conflict, they perceive God as being more punishing than as being loving. So this is to suggest that we can actually look at this construct in pre-industrial societies. I have a project also that's starting with Peter Churchin, trying to see if we can zoom back into countries and contexts, even in further back in history, and test some evolutionary questions with that data. So I'm going to keep talking now about kind of zooming into different levels of analysis, because I think it's important to realize that we can start looking at within country variation in tight loose. We can zoom into organizational differences and even our own households. If you think about where your household falls in terms of how strict or permissive it is, we can also measure that as well. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of data, state level, and then getting it to the individual level in terms of how tightness manifests at the individual level and in the brain before I turn to which is better. I'll just mention this study was also looking at tight loose within the context of the United States, which is a large heterogeneous country. Not all countries will have big variation in tight loose, but in the US, we can actually develop measures of using archival data on the amount of strictness at the state level versus latitude, which we did here in this study. And you see here that southern states and Midwestern states tended to be tighter than the coasts. Here is also a map of natural disasters in the US that correlates very strongly with our tightness looseness scores, as does other variables like food scarcity. In the book, I also talk quite a bit about other factors that like founding factors of which kinds of groups settled in different regions. For example, people who settled in the South tended to be from honor cultures where there are strict codes for behavior, and honor cultures tend to be tight. Not all tight cultures are honor cultures, but the reverse tends to be the case. We know that also diversity also is very highly connected to looseness in terms of where it settled in the East and the West coasts. And people, of course, who went out to the West Coast were very risk-taking, adventurous. And so that also, there's some other founding and bottom-up factors that also can explain some of the variation in tight loose in the 50 states. I want to just show you also that order versus openness trade-off tends to also be found at the state level. So for example, we know that in scores of personality across the states, that tight states tend to have higher conscientiousness, rule orientation. dutifulness. They also tend to have more law enforcement, less homelessness, and less divorce per capita. And they have higher self-control, at least on recreational drug use, as well as less debt. Tight states in our data tend to be more polite. My beloved New York, which ranks very loose, is one of the rudest states in the union. So you could see the same kind of correlates at the state level. State looseness, on the flip side, is correlated with personality openness from the big five. It also is correlated with creativity, more patents per capita, more fine artists per capita, and much more equality, from fewer EEOC claims to more minority-owned businesses controlling for minorities in states and so forth. And loose cultures, while they're rude, tend to actually be rated as much more fun. So there's the trade-off of tight loose in action. Of course, we can zoom into states and look at different areas that might have loose pockets in tight states or tight pockets in loose states as well. So I want to talk about that this construct, though. I've been talking about chronic differences in tightness and looseness, but also we of course know that tight loose can change over time. So we can start to look at, for example, in the US, can we track loosening and tightening in the US 50 states over the last 200 years or so? And we can do that. Case studies would suggest that looseness has increased in the US, things like fashion norms and entertainment norms, punishment norms, music, what's permissible, the range of behavior that's seen as permissible in wide range of contexts has increased anecdotally. In a study that we published recently, we wanted to try to test this theoretically. And what we did was we developed new computational linguistic dictionaries to try to track tightness, looseness over the last 200 years using large, big data. So for example, in this case, we can see different tight and loose words in Google News, which has about 1 trillion words, and see in a 300-dimensional space the kind of semantic similarity along tightness and looseness types of conceptions. So for example, you see here on the left, tight words in our dictionary include things like restrain, prevent, comply, adhere, enforce, discourage, compel, forbid. Loose words include things like allow and freedom, openness, leeway, flexibility, and they all tend to cohere together. And with this dictionary, we can analyze lots of different texts. We now can go into other texts like Google Books and see have there been shifts in tightness, looseness over the last 200 years. And that's what you'll see here in this particular graph. We'll see that words that were connoting tightness were used much less and less frequently from 1800 to today, and words connoting looseness were used much more frequently. So you could see that there are also some shifts over time, as you might expect during times of threat. We see actually tightening increasing and loosening decreasing. We see that this dictionary is correlated, as you would expect, with things like during times of tightness, more laws, more Supreme Court cases, higher religiosity, and even less profanity in TV shows, and the flip side with looseness. I want to show you also the tight-loose trade-off we can sort of track over time. Is tightness and looseness with these dictionaries correlated with measures of openness and order? And what you see here is that in general, that's the case, that controlling for underlying trends and making this data amenable to time series, we see that periods of looseness are associated with more creativity, more patents per capita, more trademarks, more films, but also less order. So more debt, more truancy are found in times when there's more looseness. So I'm going to now kind of shift to the individual level to give you a sense as a psychologist how we think about this at the individual level. And of course, you know, there's this, we need to understand this level of analysis because we can't have strict norms without, or loose norms without people helping to reinforce them through their own psychological attributes. So it makes sense that there's a suite of psychological affordances at the individual level that help to make up and reinforce tight and loose. So there's no one particular trait. People always ask me, you know, which measure would you use to measure, you know, whether a person is tight or loose? And I like to talk about this as a tight loose mindset that's afforded by different psychological attributes. And that includes things like self-regulation, prevention, focus, and epistemic needs. In the science paper, we can see when we measure these constructs that there's a strong connection between the strictness of social norms across countries and a cross-level analysis of psychological differences in things like self-regulation? How much do people monitor their behavior vis-a-vis different standards? How much are people focused on managing their impulses and being dutiful, trying to meet those standards? And how much do people crave order and structure versus have a lot of tolerance for ambiguity? In loose cultures where there's a wide range of behavior in general, you don't need to monitor your behavior as much. You can be less conscientious and have less impulse control. And you need a lot of tolerance for ambiguity, because the reality is you see a lot of different stuff happening around you. In tighter cultures, you need higher self-monitoring ability, and you're more conscientious, have more impulse control, and there's a craving for structure. There's on my website a tight loose mindset quiz where you can determine where you fall on this continuum. And I want to emphasize, of course, all of us can quickly tighten or loosen depending on the situation. Many of us, when we're in libraries or in funerals or classrooms, we tighten up. But when we're in parties or public parks, we can loosen up. So we know that this is a dynamic construct, but nevertheless, based on our own histories, our own socialization, our own age, gender, culture, class, this can all relate to why we might fall differently on the tight loose continuum. And I think it's important to think about, how not only why we might have evolved to have our own place on this continuum, but how people around us vary on the tight loose mindset. Truth be told, I veer moderately loose on my own quiz. My husband, who's a lawyer, tends to veer moderately tight. So we have a lot of negotiations in our household over things like how do you load the dishwasher, which I get a lot of feedback about. But the more general point is that once we understand where we fall in the mindset, we can start thinking about how to empathize with others about where they fall and the kinds of conflicts that we might need to resolve when it comes to tightness and looseness differences. Like in any negotiation, I also study and teach negotiation. Part of that is figuring out what's your priority. As a parent, what domains have to be tight and what domains could be looser. And I can tell you a little about my negotiations on this, but this just suggests that we can actually harness the power of social norms to negotiate them as needed, which will become something that becomes more clear as we keep going in the talk. I do want to mention that we wanted to try to peer into what's happening in the brain in terms of how are norms ingrained. What's interesting is that even though social norms are so important, there's been very little research on norms. There's been a lot of work on economic types of contexts like fairness norms, but not on sort of everyday behaviors. And we wanted to understand what are the neural markers of social norm adherence and detection of norm violations. One candidate for this is the N400 negative deflection 400 milliseconds after a stimulus, which has been linked to the context of processing incongruities. So we thought this might be a good candidate for understanding social norms. We also wanted to see whether or not there's cultural differences in these event response potentials and 400 when it comes to social norm violations. There should be some kind of differences that are socialized that we can see with brain activity. But also beyond just this descriptive difference, we wanted to see, does this predict these differences in neural activity? Do they predict differences in the tight-loose trade-off in terms of self-control, ethnocentrism, creativity? And the idea was that people who notice norm violations a lot should also have higher self-control and start having more of those feelings of superiority that we see in other ethnocentrism studies of tight-loose, but they also might have lower creativity. Whereas people who show very much lower brain activity when it comes to processing norm violations might have less self-control and less ethnocentrism, but they might be more creative, which really involves thinking outside of the box. So in this study, what we did was we developed a new paradigm to try to understand the neural biological foundations of social norm violation detection. And if you were in the study, you would see that you've been given stimuli where you were told that Amanda is in a certain context. On the left, she's in an art museum and she's dancing. That's kind of weird. That's a strong violation in most contexts. Another is a weaker violation. Amanda's in the park and she's dancing. That's what we call a weak violation. And then Amanda's at a tango lesson and she's dancing, and that's something that's appropriate. We have many different trials across different conditions and blocks where we can actually vary the appropriateness of different behaviors in different situations. And what we found was really interesting. First of all, just talking about similarities, which Harry Trinas always taught me to do, we could see that there was a very robust N400 response for both United States participants and our Chinese participants in terms of the central parietal area. compared to even the weak situation versus appropriate. We see an N400 amplitude. We also see this much stronger when it comes to violations of behavior in stronger situations. And we see this again invariant across cultural contexts. I want to also mention for people who study N400 and semantic violations, things like Michelle is having coffee with dog, which right now your N400 just went off. We did show that the N400 related to social norm violations is distinct from this N400. It's different processing when you're looking at norm violations than just linguistic violations. And also linguistic violations didn't predict other behavior in our study, but norm violations did. But what was interesting is that in the frontal area, we found that this is the area of the brain that's involved in theory of mind and punishment decisions. We find a strong difference between Americans and Chinese. Chinese had a very strong N400 in the frontal region, and Americans had much less of an N400 response in the frontal area. And what we can see here is that these differences, cultural differences in N400 responses in the frontal area, were related to cultural difference in self-control, in superiority, and in creativity. Creativity was measured here in terms of your coming up with unique ideas for a brick or a paperclip, as is done in other creativity tasks. So this is just to say that we can start looking at the neurobiological foundations. We have other work right now that we've been doing based on an Air Force Minerva grant that's looking at how the N400 changes as people are adapting to different cultures and how that also affects adaptation and cultural shifts in some of these trade-offs I've been talking about. So I'm going to now get to that question finally, which is which is better, tight or loose? And this, of course, has been a question that's been debated over the centuries. There are people who would argue for freedom and others that would argue for constraint, or what I would call tight loose. So for example, Plato and Confucius and Hobbes all would argue for having rules. On the flip side, John Stuart Mill, Freud would argue for latitude. Freud thought rules made people neurotic. So which is the case? Is it tight or loose? Well, we sort of had the hunch that maybe it's neither. Maybe it's the case that groups have to evolve to be tight or loose for good reason based on their ecologies. But as countries get to be extreme, or groups in general get to be extreme, too tight or too loose, they would start to have a lot of dysfunctions. Actually, people like Durkheim talked about this. He talked about groups that had total anomie, or we call normlessness, extreme looseness, as having a lot of anemic suicide, that they were so normless and so uncoordinated that people wanted to escape. On the flip side, he talked about groups that had fatalistic suicide, that were so rule-bound and repressive that they wanted to escape, again, for different reasons. So we wanted to test whether this is actually the case. And this is what I call the Goldilocks principle of tight loose. Again, the idea that groups need to veer tight or loose for good ecological reasons, but as groups get extreme, there could be problems. And you can see that with this data. If you think about extremes of countries that focus on order versus are normless, and this is what you can see with the data. We control for the main effect and control for other factors like GDP. And you can see that both extreme tight and extreme loose cultures have higher depression, higher suicide, lower happiness, and higher blood pressure. This is to suggest that sometimes there can be these kind of mismatches in terms of norm strength. This is not just something that's relevant to nations. More recently, I've been studying this in different contexts, different groups, and we can see this in the literature. For example, this need to balance freedom and constraint. We might need to have different types of leaderships given our industry and other contexts. But we know that as leaders get giving too much discretion or too little discretion, they actually tend to have followers who think they're ineffective on these extremes. Same with parenting. If we think about the Goldilocks principle applied to parenting, parents might need to veer tight or loose given good reasons. But as they get to be overly strict or overly lax, we know from research in developmental psychology that children wind up suffering. In overly strict contexts, children lack self-discipline and self-confidence. They tend to develop depression, anxiety, and self-control failures when they're out of those environments. And likewise, overly lax, laissez-faire parents tend to produce children that tend to produce poor academic habits. They engage in risky behaviors and so forth. So this is something that we can see in parenting, and we can also see it as well with even things like decision-making, having too much or too little choice, as my colleague Barry Schwartz would say, and the paradox of choice is problematic. It's having that kind of balance. And I would also apply this more recently to even things like organizational innovation. We know that loose groups are really good at creativity, but they might not be so good at implementation, whereas tight groups are very good at implementation, but they might struggle with creativity. So it's the balance, being able to combine this. And you see the same curvilinear with national level innovation on indices that combine this kind of exploration and exploitation. In general, countries that have that balance tend to do better on this index. Okay, I'm going to just talk for a couple more minutes and then open it up for questions. And I want to get to now the last part of my talk, which has to do with, again, just summarizing tight loose balance. The level of norm strength should be calibrated to the degree of threat, but we might need to identify contexts where we need to tighten norms that have become too loose. I call this structured looseness. And we might need to identify contexts where we need to loosen tight norms that have become ineffective, something I call flexible tightness. So I want to emphasize that really I see this construct as negotiable. And right now, as Rana mentioned, I'm doing some work with the military to try to develop measures of tightness looseness in organizations that are domain specific so that we can negotiate norm strength to become more innovative, but also maintaining the kind of order that we might need in the military in particular. So last but not least, I want to talk about tight loose and COVID and some of the data that we have on this. I think many of us really never, of course, envisioned that we would be studying the kinds of collective threats that we've been looking at from an arm's distance with our data, looking at collective threat in modern nations or in pre-industrial societies. And now we're seeing a collective threat that all of us are subject to, painfully so, around the world. And so, I started out thinking about this as we started to lock down that, I've been mentioning that there's the need for coordination to survive these kinds of threats. Threat leads to the evolution of tightness in some of our computational models that we published. And it makes sense, as I mentioned, theoretically, that when you have a lot of threat, you need stricter rules to organize social action and to prevent defectors really from taking over the population. That's not to say that we can't be innovative in other ways. For example, universities now need to be strict in order to maintain and reduce the threat of corona, but they can also be very innovative. For example, some places are starting to look for traces of COVID in sewage, and that's a really innovative idea to be able to indirectly and obtrusively measure where there might be outbreaks. So this is not to say that countries should not have some elements of looseness, but in terms of following norms, it makes sense from evolutionary game theory and also our other data that we should enhance rule strength. Of course, we might see some of these, what I call evolutionary mismatches occurring. And this is, I think, what a lot of us have witnessed over the last 6 months. And this is a concept from evolutionary biology that would suggest that traits that have evolved in one environment can be highly disadvantaged in another environment. My colleague David Sloan Wilson has written quite a bit about this, and others have argued that because environmental changes can occur very quickly, but evolution is gradual, that there could be some delays in the kind of switches that we see when it comes to norm following. This has been applied to contexts like obesity and drug addiction, gambling, but it's also been applied to non-humans. And one of the more interesting studies showing that sea turtles who tend to naturally follow light actually are following light pollution and actually really it's causing a lot of problems in terms of their ability to survive. So this just suggests that when there is environmental changes, it's not always the case that groups can rapidly adapt, or when there's interference in the signal of when a normal signal, in this case, let's say threat to tightening, when there's interference in that signal, then we might find delays in strengthening norms. So this kind of raises the question of whether there's a liability of looseness during collective threat. I started getting worried about this in March, and I published this op-ed in the Boston Globe that was entitled, "To Survive the Coronavirus, the United States Must Tighten Up." It's not just about medicine, it's about culture. And I was sort of thinking about the idea that, the looseness that pervades the US in general has really made us a very creative, innovative place, but also it's hard for people some people, and in some contexts, to sacrifice freedom for constraint, because it's something that has not been necessarily needed over the course of our history. Of course, with 9/11, we did tighten up, in other contexts we have, but the question is whether loose cultures would sufficiently adapt. And what the data show that is that there is a strong connection between tightness and lower cases per million and lower deaths per million. Of course, there's lots of other predictors. So we want to try to see, like, does this actually predict above and beyond other factors? And what you see here is just a whole bunch of tables looking at, first of all, if you just look at testing and GDP and Gini, percent migrants, government efficiency, these are all important predictors of cases per million. Tightness, that you see in the second column, predicts above and beyond this, with tighter cultures having fewer cases per million. This also is found controlling for collectivism and power distance, previous vaccinations that have been proven to be related to coping with COVID, total population size, age. The effect also is found for other things like climate and authoritarianism, relational mobility, other kinds of factors. Again, not one factor is obviously only related to COVID-19 cases and deaths, but the strictness of norms tends to be something that relates to lower cases, and also even more strongly connected to deaths per million. And you see that with this graph here. You also see that's with the same chart here with the data in terms of controlling for various different factors. This is as of September 11th. It could conceivably change in the second wave, but I think that it just suggests that that we need to develop interventions to increase the acceptance of these kinds of norms in looser cultures. This is also, I'll just show you a computational model that we developed on the same side that tried to replicate this and look at the idea that what you see here on the left are cooperation rates over time as a function of threat. And on the right, you see alive rates, agents that basically stay in the model. And what we see here, this is a model based on conformance transmission. Tight groups are defined here in terms of having a higher probability of conforming to their neighbors as compared to loose groups. And we test various different configurations of that for robustness. And what you can see here on these graphs is that over time, as threat is increasing, that tight groups actually start cooperating much more earlier as compared to loose groups who catch up, but it takes much longer. Okay, I think I'm going to just end with a couple of comments. I think, my view, we really need to be focused on calibrating to change in COVID. That means tightening when there's threat. It means loosening when it's safe. And we need really clear signals, of course, from our local leaders, our national leaders, to help us to calibrate on this. Because unlike some other types of collective threats like warfare, this is a little more abstract until it really hits us at home. It's psychologically distant in Jakob Chope's terms. And it's just something I think we need to start relating to the notion of tight, loose ambidexterity, sort of having the flexibility to tighten and loosen as needed. Of course, we are negotiating with our friends, our colleagues, our kids all the time around this. There's challenges in negotiating with this. Challenges for rule breakers, if we can call them, people who are looser, are that people feel there's a great threat to their autonomy and their liberty. And here I would say that we really need to focus on the fact that this is temporary, that tightening is not going to last forever. It's really useful in reducing threat. We've seen that in our computational models, and that this might be helpful for people who are having challenges and having a lot of psychological dissonance. On the flip side, people who are, people who veer tighter might have a hard time loosening when it's actually safe. And that's because people who veer tighter tend to have a lot of threat to control and order. And here we might think about helping people to gradually loosen, to kind of test the waters out and do things that are safer before jumping right in to places that might feel really too risky to people who veer on the looser side. So that's just kind of the last part of my talk. The book Rulemakers or Breakers was written before the pandemic, and it talks a lot about the research that I've done. I also zoom into other levels about social class, politics, the elections, and the connection of tight loose. And I'd be happy to answer any questions and comments that you have. And I thank you so much for having me and for being so attentive through this webinar. I know people are really zoomed out, Zoom, fatigue. So thank you so much. And I'll just hand it over to you, Rena.
Hi, thank you so much, Michelle. And again, thank you for being here. We really appreciate it. It was such a thought-provoking talk. And I've learned a lot. For me, especially the graphs showing the extremes in tightness and looseness and how it correlates with suicides, how it correlates with blood pressure. I found really compelling, very stark evidence about the way culture can shape actual real outcomes in our society around us. So I think I will, I just want to remind everybody, if you have questions, please put them through the chat and Sarah will call on you. I have so many questions, so I'm going to start us off with a few. The first one is, I found it very interesting in your talk about the evolution of cultures from tight and loose. And for me, it raised a lot of questions. Do we typically see cultures going from tight to loose, loose to tight? Or is it that cultures are constantly moving around? And you talked about how threats are an instigator, threats to society, threats to norms are an instigator of this. Do we see the threats shift us more in one direction or another? I just wanted to understand a little bit more about that.
This is a great question. And, the way I think about culture is that it's like an attractor in dynamical systems, kind of language. So there's multiple forces across different levels of analysis that's helping to keep cultures in place. So with that said, cultures change slowly, in my view. When you have a very top-down, very stark change in a culture, then we can see changes. So for example, after the Boston bombing, many of you who are in Boston will remember that there was a sense of tightening after the Boston bombing. It makes sense. But at the same time, Boston, thank God, was not bombed repeatedly. And so it could go back to its loose attractor. And I think the other way we think about change is it's bottom up, when you have a lot of different types of people that then sort of change the cultural composition of a context that can also foster change. But without changes, systemic changes across different levels, I don't think we see changes that are stable, essentially. With that said, I'm often asked about, well, is culture evoked? Is it, evolutionary? I think it can be both, because I think as humans, we have this sense of when tightening is needed in general. So after 9/11 or after Boston bombing, or even in the laboratory, when I prime people with these rinky-dink primes, of population density or of warfare, or of disasters, people immediately want more tightening. They think more violations are bad. But then again, it doesn't last outside the lab because it's not chronic. Another example of that is that the US and our data has been involved with a lot of conflict over time, but not on its own soil. It's been involved in a lot of conflict outside of the US. And that variable from the crisis archives doesn't predict tightness. It really has to be on your own soil. So I think it can be made temporarily accessible, but in order for there to be lasting change, we need those factors to be repeated and chronic. I just also want to mention that in our evolutionary game theory models, we see that, to your question of is it easier to go from tight to loose or loose to tight? We find that actually after countries or groups, these are agent-based models, tighten, it takes longer to loosen when you take away the threat. There tends to be some kind of risk aversion. I've seen this with some more recent data that's under review coming from economics, that it's easier to go from loose to tight, and it takes a little longer to loosen. That said, we clearly don't see that happening with COVID. So it's taking some time to tighten, obviously. And there's a lot of conflict over that.
Actually, that's going to lead me to my next question. Well, I have a bunch of more questions to ask.
Go for it.
Your last statement actually led me to the last question, because I've seen some really interesting work recently tying within the US, the cultural norms around frontier culture and how it correlates with adherence to COVID restrictions. And for me, I was thinking about how that frontier culture and the map you were showing, and how that correlates with tightness or looseness, and where this all fits in. And so I'd love to get your views.
Yeah, I mean, the US is such an interesting context, because the tighter states, and we haven't analyzed data in the States, but this is just kind of my own kind of N of one observation. The tighter states are actually the ones that are having the most difficulty social distancing and following mask regulations. And my interpretation of this is that tight cultures are following some rules, but they don't necessarily mean that they're the adaptive rules. And in this case, a lot of the type states are Trump supporting, and they're looking to our national leaders to tell us how serious a threat this is. This is what I meant by the evolutionary mismatch. When the threat signal is really not strong, or it's interrupted, or it's conflated, then it's hard to tighten. And I think that's kind of what's happening. And it's just going to follow the leader in a way that is not necessarily adaptive. So that's my 2 cents. That's the kind of the how I explain this. We're doing a large pre-registered study that was just accepted at JESP to try to see how to nudge people around the world, around the country, to wear masks with various different interventions. This intervention tournament inspired by Brene at Penn and others. So I'll keep you posted on what we find in terms of what nudges seem to work around the country for conservatives, liberals, people across different states, and so forth.
Oh no, that's fast. We're gonna have to have you back when you get those results.
I'll keep you posted.
Oh, Sarah, I noticed you're online. Is there a question that you want to raise?
Great. Yes. So we have a number of questions coming in on Zoom and also from our live stream on YouTube. We do have James here from Nigeria wanting to ask his question live. So I will hand it over to James.
Hi, thank you very much, Michelle, for the wonderful keynote presentation and speech. I think I like the concept of the tight-loose model. This is the second time I'm hearing it. But you presented it from a different perspective. And by the way, I would like to get that book. I was going to ask a question with regards to the tight-loose model, how it can be applied to evaluating development projects. I ask this question because I manage a very big foundation in Nigeria, and it's important to actually evaluate the results of that project. Yeah. Listening to you, I immediately discovered that this concept can be applied in several situations and contexts, and my mind went straight to the foundation and to the projects and the results we've been accomplishing and how I can use this particular theory. And then secondly, another question relating to that has to do with adaptive management, with regards to this same concept, I like the way it is quite flexible. So how can it be applied when it comes to adaptive management in the COVID era, most importantly in the post-COVID era as well? Yeah. And finally, how can you apply the tight-loose theory to achieve systemic change? Because it's talked about, you use the word systemic in the sense that whatever kind of changes and results you're looking at, you want it to be impactful. So if you can provide some insights to this.
Yeah, great questions. And I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart that you would listen to this talk again. So I do want to mention, I do think that there's a real way that we, as I mentioned, we develop social norms, we can harness them, we can manage them. It just, I think, involves really trying to be mindful about, first of all, diagnosing in any organizational context. Let's even just take the developmental organizations that you're dealing with. They have their own cultures in terms of where they veer tight or loose. And we can diagnose where organizations are, what domains they tend to be very tight in. And we can also try to shift that. So I've been doing a lot of interviews with places like in manufacturing that have really been doing very well with tight norms for a long time, but now they really want to shift. And they want to insert some discretion, some flexibility into that system. So we're working on how to do that, what kind of models. And I have some ideas about how do you try to insert some discretion into non-safety domains in the military. Do we really need to have certain types of haircuts and wear similar socks and things like that, where tightness exists in the context of the military? Or can we kind of negotiate some latitude in those contexts? So I think it's eminently negotiable. On the flip side, sometimes there's loose organizations that require some tightening, more structure, more centralization. And again, we might need to talk about different domains that we need to strengthen: accountability, monitoring, standards, and so forth, while still maintaining that kind of innovative and flexible edge that loose organizations should have, because they operate in different ecological types of contexts, markets. Your question about development is really very interesting, and I'd love to talk with you offline about this, because I think that there's a lot of new exciting work going on with Christina Bacchieri and others trying to look at and help organizations understand that social norms are really, really critical. It's not about just changing personal attitudes in a lot of these programs, whether they're about genital cutting or about early childhood marriage or other types of contexts, that fundamentally these are tight cultures. And they're also built on lots of times a culture of honor that's evolved in these contexts for reasons that we know are also tied to ecologies. And so I think we need to really dig deep into understanding the values that are supportive of these tight norms and try to negotiate those underlying values. And I think, quite frankly, a lot of times these programs are really short. In terms of like our American impatience, this is another quintessential aspect of Americans, that we tend to want things done pretty quickly. And so culture changes slowly, and we need to be very careful about going in, analyzing the strength of norms and trying to negotiate them with tribal leaders, with others. So I have a lot to say about that offline. So let's reconnect on that, because I'm really interested in that context.
Great. We also have, I want to make sure we make some time for a couple of questions from YouTube. So I'll ask 2 questions from our audience on YouTube. So the first is, do multicultural nations have specific challenges that you see, particularly within this tightness and looseness concept? And then we have another question from Alice, who is a student at the Harvard Kennedy School. And she asks, does the concept of respect fall in the tight or loose camp?
Interesting. Great questions. I think your question around multiculturalism is really important, because we know that there's a lot of conflict over this in the US that has been very multicultural and very loose. There's also conflict in other multicultural nations like the Netherlands. The Netherlands is a great example of a place that's had kind of threat, I mean, very densely populated, but because it's been so historically multicultural in terms of its trade routes and its exposure to different cultures, it was one of the most tolerant cultures for many, many years, the first multinational company and so forth. I think the issue here has to do with fake threat around diversity. I think we know that people live in their own echo chambers, and including the United States, people many times feel threatened by false senses of, let's say, immigration, illegal immigration. In our estimates, I published an op-ed on this in the LA Times last year. When we asked people around the country their estimates of how many people in this country are illegal immigrants, they were so incredibly off in terms of their perception of this. And this, not surprisingly, made them really feel threatened. And these perceptions of threat were driving, or at least related to, their support for people like Trump. It's really an interesting issue, because it's both, we live in our echo chamber, so we misattribute a lot the diversity in our context. And then we also have national leaders in some cases who actually use this to threaten people and talk about these, and to threaten people to actually help them gain election popularity. Actually, we have a new threat dictionary that I can talk to people about, that actually, just like the tight loose dictionary, can track threatening languages from politicians, from on Twitter, on other social media, because I think this is really what we're exposed to all the time, is threat on the, that is tightening us individually, and that we need to really get out of those echo chambers to really understand the other. I just want to give one more example of that. In a study that we published this year, we're looking at how Americans and Pakistanis understand each other. And when you live in these echo chambers, we really have a lot of these very extreme stereotypes. So Americans, if they know where Pakistan is, see Pakistanis as only being in mosques all the time. They perceive them as being essentially like super tight. And Pakistanis in our interviews saw Americans as being ultra loose. They thought they were half naked all the time, having beer for breakfast. They only envisioned them in parties. This is a situational sampling problem. And what we did was we exposed Pakistanis and Americans to daily diaries of each other, so they could see, like, wow, they're actually in way more different situations than I would have imagined. Pakistanis were in, playing sports and reading poetry and dancing, and Americans were, believe it or not, with their families and where they were going to work. And what was fascinating about this study is that we didn't edit these diaries at all. We just randomly assigned people to be exposed for 7 days to diaries of people in their own country or people from the other country. And then we measured their cultural distance and their attitudes toward them. And we could see, at least in this one proof of concept daily diary technique, that we could shift attitudes, that Americans, they still saw Pakistanis as leaning tighter, but they saw them as being way more similar to them than they did a week before that. And same with Pakistanis. They saw Americans as actually definitely looser, but they saw them as more moral and less doing all these egregious things. And maybe we could think about how we can use the daily diary technique to de-stereotype people, even in our own country. People who are, who don't interact with immigrants. I think once they start looking into each other's lives and see what their lives are like, they'll see far more similarity. Even though they still see differences, they'll see that there's far more similarities. We could do this with refugees and natives, conservatives and liberals, dog lovers and not, the list goes on. But anyway, that suggests that I think that the way we might help to deal with this, gets the polarization theme of this conference, is to really help people to see what their daily lives are really like. Sometimes we can do that face to face, but sometimes we might need to use things like diaries, and people like to read people's diaries, it turns out. So that's one positive thing about this method.
Great, thank you very much. We only have a couple of minutes, but we have folks who really would like to ask their questions, so we'll try and keep these brief.
Okay, I'll try to be brief too, I promise.
Oh, that's okay. No, it's great. Thank you so much for your insights. So we have Kareem on the call asking, he says, you've done a lot of consulting for different organizations, and how do you typically advise to have a strong organizational culture based on tightness and looseness? And then we also have one live question as well.
Okay, great. Bring it on. What is it?
Great. Okay. So Alan, when you're ready, you can ask your question.
Yeah, hi, can you listen to me? Hear
Yeah.
me? Yeah, thank you very much. Hi, this is Alan Clutterbuck from Argentina. I run an NGO that tries to bring together politicians from different parties, different ideological backgrounds, to build consensuses, to try to reduce the level of polarization and confrontation. And what you see within parties is that when you create an environment, a culture that can mesh together, you have people unfreezing and becoming loose, but when they go back to their primary parties, they become tight again, and publicly it is difficult for them to engage and to discuss, and basically to build a consensus on policies.
Yeah.
How can we work around this issue to reduce the level of polarization and allow and provide for more consensus building policy making?
This is such a great question, and I was really loved your comment yesterday on the call also. And I was remembering a lot of the negotiation literature that ties into your work, where it was looking at how boundary spanning negotiators, representatives, really need to manage being kind of cooperative people at the table, but also manage the kind of accountability pressures they have with their constituents. So there's a large literature on that. I'd love to connect with you on that. I can send you some of that. Let me just start with the first question. Really interesting questions. How do you diagnose tight and loose organizations? And I think I've been very influenced by Ben Schneider, one of the founders of the field of organizational climate and culture, and thinking about it in terms of different levels. So what are the people, the practices, and the leadership types of styles that make up that organization? And we can actually see big differences across tight and loose organizations in terms of, like I mentioned earlier, conscientiousness and prevention-oriented people going into and being attracted to tighter organizations. Practices in tight organizations are more standardized and more efficient. And the leadership in those organizations tends to be more autonomous, calling the shots. Loose organizations have a very different set of people, practices, and leaders in general. The people tend to be more risk-oriented, more impulsive. The practices tend to be having much more flexibility and latitude, and the leadership tends to be more empowering and charismatic, visionary. These tend to evolve like nations in industries where they make sense. So tight organizations tend to be found in places like airlines and hospitals and police. They tend to be in contexts where there's a lot of risk and safety concerns. And loose organizations evolve in contexts where there's less risk, there's more innovation demands and so forth. That said, we can see that sometimes either of these extremes need to insert some structure into them. Loose organizations might get a little bit too chaotic. And we see this with some Glassdoor reviews. You can look at the language of people saying so unpredictable, so chaotic. That's where we need to stop and say, okay, how do we insert some structure into this while maintaining its looseness and that ecology? Flip side, tighter organizations like United Airlines is a good example that, arguably needs to veer tight. We don't want them making all sorts of weird decisions. It's an airline, but they were getting so tight that people were randomly and blindly following the rules. And they needed to start inserting some discretion into non-safety domains. And actually United Airlines is doing that now. You can see that they're trying to actively negotiate what I would call flexible tightness. So that's one answer, very not so brief. And then finally, I would just say that one of the things that I've discovered around helping people to have empathy for people who are different from them is they recognize that they have their own strengths, or their group has their own strengths, but they're the same liability. They have liabilities that's offset by other people. So, for example, as I mentioned, the extreme aspect of looseness is that people are uncoordinated. They might be creative, but uncoordinated and not very efficient. On the flip side, tight cultures are very efficient and coordinated in general, but they also suffer from less creativity. So we need both, basically. In an ideal world, we would have order and openness. On a recent podcast coming out in the BBC on the Big Idea, David Edmonds asked me, which city would you say can you nominate to have the Goldilocks of order and openness? And I think I would nominate Toronto. At least right now, I would nominate Toronto as having both order and openness, because it's extraordinarily diverse and tolerant, but it has a lot of order. It's very, comparatively speaking, less crime. So I guess my broader point is that I would envision a world where we try to negotiate both of these, even given different levels of threats and so forth. So I hope that was brief enough.
No, that was perfect. And unfortunately, we've not only has our time ended, we've gone slightly over. So I do want to close out the session.
Sure.
I do want to say thanks to several people first. Thanks to Michelle. We were so excited to have you here. We'd love to have you back again. Especially, I want to know all about your big the mask experiments and so forth. I also I want to thank Audrey and Sarah and Assam for putting together such an engaging panel and for allowing me to be part of it, and to all the participants. As I said at the beginning, we know this is a challenging time for everyone, and we're just so grateful and excited to have you here and to be able to continue to engage in this way, despite everything that's happening in the world. And I've been told, and I don't know if Assam, if you're adding anything after, but I've been told I have that the week is continuing, and we still have a lot of engaging and wonderful programming. And I particularly want to highlight 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, a Thursday panel on the politics of us and them, featuring Ben Enke, Leo Burstein, Liliana Mason, and our own Danny Radrick. And on that note, I'll pass it to Assam. No? Okay.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Michelle.
Thank
See you
you.
guys tomorrow.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.